Now, another unusual characteristic of events in the land of the electron is that the very act of trying to observe the electron inevitably changes or distorts its motion. In other words, the observing scientist and the thing he is trying to observe are closely connected with one another and cannot be entirely separated into the observer over here and the thing he is observing over there. Well, in 1961, Bohm and his wife Cyril were visiting a library one day in London, and Cyril picked up a book that said, "The observer is the observed." She knew that the relationship between the observer and the observed held special meaning for her husband, and she gave the book to him. That book was The First and Last Freedom by Ojai Krishnamurti. And that is where the unusual collaboration between Bohm and Krishnamurti began. The observer and the thing observed are connected. Krishnamurti stated this to be the case for events in the psychological field, and Bohm already knew it was true in quantum physics. From that point onwards, an extraordinary collaboration between the two men followed. Now, the sequence of events that brought Krishnamurti to a position where he could be appreciated by a man like David Bohm could hardly have been more different. Krishnamurti was first identified at the age of 14 by representatives of the Theosophical Society as, who said he would grow up to be a world teacher, a role previously filled by the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad. An international organization called the Order of the Star in the East was created specifically to help Krishnamurti fulfill this destiny. When he was 34 years old, Krishnamurti broke away from and dissolved the Order of the Star in the East. He said that no religious organization can possibly lead human beings to psychological freedom. He developed an entirely new and independent point of view, a comprehensive description of the landscape of consciousness. His description was completely secular and did not rely on any form of divine intervention or guidance. The focus of attention was on thought, emotion, desire, action, and motivation, and on the sources of conflict within the individual and in human relationship. But Krishnamurti's philosophy was not always easy to understand, and in order to get a grasp on what he was trying to say, I think it's helpful to see the larger context in which he lived and functioned, and David Bohm is part of that context. Not only that, but the context that surrounded Bohm also became part of the context of Krishnamurti. And I'd like to read a passage from my book that illustrates that theme. Another benefit associated with my new living situation was the opportunity to cultivate a friendship with David Bohm. Bohm was a scientist of the highest order, a world-class physicist who made enduring contributions to the foundations of quantum theory. He had been Krishnamurti's close friend and collaborator since 1961, and the record of their dialogues fills several published volumes. Bohm was closely involved in the formation and development of Brockwood Park, our sister school in England, and he and his wife spent several weeks in Ojai each spring during the period of Krishnamurti's annual visit. Bohm was a shy but exceptionally kind and friendly man with an inexhaustible appetite for dialogue about the nature and dynamics of consciousness. He often held evening meetings for school staff at which various topics of this kind were explored. Although he was meticulous in his thought and expression, Bohm's manner in conducting such meetings was relaxed and accessible. Bohm's presence at Arya Vihara attracted other interesting guests as well. Among these was Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist from England, a bright new star in intellectual circles there. Sheldrake had just published A New Science of Life, a book whose thesis recommended a radical readjustment of Darwinian theory in order to correlate evidence drawn from embryology with field studies of animals in the wild. He had proposed the existence of a new feature of the world embedded in the fabric of reality called morphogenetic fields, a kind of force or energy that serves to shape the development of species in ways not imagined by conventional evolutionary theory. Sheldrake's idea was expressed in his book with a creative flair and a breadth of knowledge that made him the darling of avant-garde intellectuals, even as he was reviled by traditionalists. Bohm was an older and far more established member of the scientific elite, but he was receptive to those who dared to challenge ingrained assumptions, as he himself had done throughout his career. Sheldrake was also akin to Bohm in the wide range of his interests, including a fascination with spiritual movements of all stripes. Sheldrake's brilliance was of a kind that sparkles in a social setting as well as in the pages of a book. His presence at Krishnamurti's lunch table was unlike anything I had seen. In an offhand and effortless manner, he held everyone spellbound with hilarious and insightful stories about the popular gurus and spiritual centers he had visited. His rather cynical attitude toward the central figures at these places, coupled with an eye for detail, was well suited for this audience, and his wicked sense of humor was appreciated by all. Another notable guest was Richard Feynman, the celebrated Nobel Prize winner in physics, who traveled up to Ojai from Caltech in Pasadena to visit with and pay his respects to Bohm. On one such occasion, Bohm invited Feynman to join the group at Krishnamurti's lunch table, and the invitation was accepted. The three world figures sat together at the end of the long dining room, and I felt very fortunate to have a ringside seat. Of the three men, Feynman was the most gregarious, and he carried the conversation. He talked about his childhood and how he had acquired an interest in the natural world from an early age. He used to go on long walks with his father, he said, in which his father pointed out the intricate web of relationships in the world around him. He said with a grin that he later learned that not everything his father told him was true, but nevertheless illustrated some larger point or encouraged him to observe and investigate. Feynman asked me to describe the approach to education at Oak Grove. I hesitated to speak and glanced at Krishnaji to see if he wanted to field the question, but he nodded to me to proceed. I said something about educating the whole child, psychologically as well as academically. Feynman responded to this distinction and said that his life and career had been devoted to exploring the outer world rather than the psychological issues with which Krishnamurti was concerned. I wanted to point out that Bohm was uniquely qualified in both areas. However, I did not want to show anyone up, so I expressed it by saying that Bohm was one who, quote, knew a little bit about both. But Feynman took my words literally and corrected me rather sternly. He said, "I can assure you that David Bohm knows more than a little bit about physics." So to understand Krishnamurti, it's helpful to understand the context in which he lived and functioned. And if you look at his life in its entirety, I think we could make the case that the largest single element of the context of his work was his collaboration with David Bohm. And so we have to ask ourselves, what would possess a man like Bohm, with his impeccable scientific credentials, to become so deeply involved in Krishnamurti's work? This is a very uncommon collaboration indeed. If we consider all the top physicists of the 20th century, Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, Pauli, Feynman, no one else took a simultaneous interest in anything psychological. But Bohm not only went deeply into the psychological field, he did so in connection with a man outside the mainstream of psychological discourse. Why did this happen? I believe Bohm had a realization in his professional life that something is deeply confused or mistaken in the consciousness of humanity. Bohm was stung in a profound and personal way by the consequences of his appearance before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. But that could be excused by the irrationality of politics without negating the possibility of something sane and rational in other spheres of life, especially in science. But when science itself exhibited the same kind of rigid, closed, irrational attitude, it became apparent to Bohm that the sources of conflict and confusion in the human condition arise at a very deep level. If we cannot disprove Bohm, then we must agree to ignore him. In fact, the source of confusion in human beings lies at the level of thought, or the thinking process itself. There is something about the very nature of thought that is corrupted or infected with something false. So this is the level at which Krishnamurti and Bohm both operated. By entirely independent means, they came to a common level of understanding about some fundamental features of thought and consciousness.